Hello again, everybody. Back for the fourth time with another look at the major archetypes in the Tribal Legacy Wars format and the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event. And today we are looking at Reanimator decks. And I have one loaded up here. This was played by Endless Nameless on August the 6th of 2011 in Tribal Apocalypse 31. Now, before we go into the deck lists, just to clarify for my definition on the Reanimator decks, if the sole purpose of reanimating something is part of an instant win combo, such as many of the Cephalid Illusionist Mill Your Whole deck, Narcomoebas, Dread Return, that sort of business, that is not being covered today. Those are not traditionally considered to be Reanimator decks, and I'll cover them in another department. What we are covering today is strictly decks that are intending to reanimate some overpowered fat creature and win with it. So, what we are going to look at first is this list here, which was a Praetor's list, and it was piloted probably just a few months after all of these Praetors were printed and available on Magic the Gathering Online, and they are a very powerful cycle going across all colors. Vorinclex is probably the weaker, although he's not bad if you get him down rather early. He can screw your opponent out. Elish Norn is simply backbreaking. Shield Dread has a lot of synergy with the reanimation plan. If you have other fatties in the yard, you can just start bringing them back. Jingataxis is the same way because you draw 7 cards at the beginning of your end step. You're going to draw into more guys, probably discard a bunch of guys during your cleanup step, and repeat the process all over again. So as a tribe, they're extremely good with reanimation strategies. Now, Endless Nameless used the traditional suite of the most powerful reanimation spells. The enablers to get creatures into the graveyard are Entomb and Careful Study, and then the ability to reanimate them from the graveyard is Reanimate itself, which is very solid at a 1 mana option. The only problem, of course, with it is that you lose a ton of life, so you have to be careful. You usually can't use this spell more than a couple of times unless you're reanimating something with lifelink or something along those lines. Exhume. The drawback on Exhume is that it is symmetrical, so if your opponent is also playing some kind of graveyard shenanigans, he may be able to get value out of it as well. You're just hoping that you get the most value out of that card. And Animate Dead, which has very little drawback compared to all of them. You lose only a point of power for using it. The vulnerability, though, is that your reanimated creature is then vulnerable to enchantment removal, because if someone destroys the Animate Dead, that's it for your reanimated guy. But that's you're much more likely in this format to see spot removal against creatures than you are to see any kind of enchantment removal in particular in anyone's deck. So that's the look at your enablers there. The interesting thing about this deck, it's extremely streamlined. He's only running 18 lands in this list, and you can see he's got 1 of each basic, a set of duels, and then 12 fetch lands, which seems like an enormous amount. Of course, it will thin his deck, and he's not anticipating needing more than a few lands. He's not going to ever hardcast any of these guys. He's got 2 brainstorms. The fetch land's obviously very good with Brainstorm when you're hunting for something, but the interesting thing about this is that, yes, you can play an 18-land mana base with this kind of deck, and that these decks do in normal Legacy, but those decks have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 cantrips in them quite commonly. So his deck here is really only relying on Brainstorm and, I suppose, the Careful Studies to try to draw him into that second land, which in all likelihood he's going to need. So again, this is a very fragile deck as well. He doesn't have anything in here that would help him defeat any kind of graveyard hate, for instance. He doesn't have any duress effects or anything like that. And that's one of the flaws with a reanimation strategy where you have to use, where you're using your entire creature base as things to reanimate. On one hand, you'll have no shortage of fatties to dump into the yard, but on the other hand, you're leaving yourself very, very thin on any kind of support cards. But again, that's going to be a problem however you do build this, unless you manage to use creatures, body snatcher, that sort of thing, which handles some of the reanimation load for you. But of course, that's not as fast, and he's going for a real glass cannon approach here. Now, an interesting thing I noticed about this, and I'm going to show real quick a older deck that was piloted by this same player back in 2010. And this is back when the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event played in the classic Tribal Wars format before it switched over to Legacy. And you can see here that he is using cards that were also later banned later that year. This is the height in 2010 of Reanimator in the wider Legacy format when it was popular, before the Mystical Tutor ban. And he is running, strangely enough, 67 cards, which makes me question whether or not this deck list from the old article was correct or not. He's also running Moat, which has been banned in current events, so this deck would not be legal now for both the Moat and the Mystical Tutor reasons. He appears with this deck to have simply stapled on the entire Legacy Reanimator package to 20 powerful angels and thrown in a few moats and called it a day. But it was good enough to go 2-1 on this day. Of course, his later deck, which I showed you just prior to this with the Praetors, was a 3-0 deck. And now that Praetor deck went 3-0 on August 6th, was an endangered event, but it went 3-0 the prior week and 2-1 the week before that in regular events. So it was an extraordinary powerful choice. This deck shows an example of Reanimator decks having an alternate route. This one does have a way to get around Graveyard Hate because he has a show and tell plan, which can also be accelerated by the use of Lotus Petal. So that's one way that you could try to build your deck to get around potential Graveyard Hate if you're expecting to see it. Now, this deck apparently was kind of controversial when he ran it in 2010, and I want to show you a comment here from the original thread on Pure MTGO with the write-up of the article. Just to point out, he was talking originally about somebody who had complained about the strength of his deck, and there was some discussion about whether that was about the value of the cards. But one of the comments that he made here, which I think shows the weakness of the deck, is he says that a turn 2 Iona versus a monocolored deck can be game over, but the reality is that that's a rare play. Unfortunately, it's likely to be turn 3 or 4, gets removed, and leaves him totally defenseless against a swarm of 2/2 guys. And again, that's one of the things that is a fundamental flaw in this kind of strategy, is that unless the thing you're reanimating just completely takes over the game, and is immune to removal or gets a lot of value out of just coming into play so that the removal doesn't just blank what you've done. What you're doing is you're paying a lot of life, going through a lot of work to get something that they just remove and then barrel over you. Or if it's too late when it comes down, your opponent's board position might be better so that your win isn't inevitable. The reason that Reanimator is good in Legacy is that you can use all these cantrips to make it so that you're consistently reanimating something insane on turn 2, 3 at the latest if you have to fight through some hate. So that's a big difference between playing Reanimator in this format and playing it in wider Legacy. But again, you can see here that it does have a history of success. However, I did notice that it is extremely rare. I don't know if that's due to the dearth of Entombs in the format because of their expense up until recently or not, but it hasn't been a widely played archetype, the traditional Entomb reanimate strategy. So looking at other reanimation archetypes, I decided to take a look just very briefly at a deck that I piloted. I'll just call this a bonus deck because it finished a 5th, narrowly missing top 4. And it was featured in the article during the week that it was played, which was week 81. You can go back and look at that. But both Kumagoro and I have tried using Goblin Welders and various fatties as a way to reanimate quickly. This deck that I built here was capable with Mox Diamonds and Anger in the graveyard and Faithless Looting of potentially spitting out one of these fat artifacts on turn 1. But again, the only reason I'll stop by this deck real quick, again, you can go back to Week 81's article to see some discussion of it and a full list in writing. But one of the things that I did with this deck was use Stoneforge Mystic into Batterskull as the backup plan. And again, it's a sort of a core principle of decks like these that if you can fit one in, have a backup plan, because things don't always go the way that you think that they're going to go. I looked through a lot of the archives and did not find a very good selection of Reanimator decks. It seems like an unexplored archetype. I'd played around with Loyal Retainers at one point, but other people who have used Loyal Retainers have used them sort of just incidentally and not as a main strategy. So that's an area that could be exploited. In an effort to sort of widen the coverage of the Reanimator archetype here, I'm going to go ahead and show a deck that I really enjoyed, which was a deck that Kumagoro played. If I can find it, there it is, from Event 57 back on February 4th. That date is wrong, should be 2012. He finished second with this. This is an Avatars deck, and it's a Living End deck. And now it has a backup plan of being able to hard cast the creatures, which I think is very solid to do that. But what Kuma's done here with his Living Death build. Living Death is one of the more powerful cards that is available in the format. It's basically a Patriarch's Bidding stapled to a Damnation, and it blows your opponent out pretty much every time you cast it. I know every time I've had it cast against me, it's game over. And so you could consider Living Death and Patriarch's Bidding decks to be sort of a second side of Reanimator. Instead of focusing on getting one ridiculous threat out immediately, although Kuma does have the ability to do that by Exhume, instead of focusing solely on that, it focuses on building up to a huge play where you simply wipe your opponent's board and end up with a massive board position that 1 or 2 spot removal spells can't overcome. And so in that way, it's a lot more resilient than the traditional Entomb, Reanimate, Exhume decks are. There are a lot of great synergies that have been built into this deck here. As a way of getting creatures into the graveyard, Kuma has Liliana the Veil, which can also double as discard against a control opponent. Sacrificing a creature ability is good against early rush. Avatar Discord will dump a couple guys into the yard, as well as providing a rather formidable body in the way early. Scion of Darkness, an excellent choice here within the tribe. It cycles, so if you're digging for a Living Death or some other money spell there to bring all your guys back, you can dump him in the yard, cycling, and then of course bring him back later. And in fact, if you actually get to swing with this guy, you get to do something rather fun and steal the opponent's creatures from their graveyards. So, Avatar of Woe can be cast rather cheaply, assuming that you've been able to fill your yard, which you may well have with things like Buried Alive. Overall, very, very nice synergies between a number of the cards here. And again, going back to the have a backup plan, here he has a backup plan of using the Cabal Coffers to just actually hard cast these things if the reanimation plan does not go off. So anyways, just that is the quick look at the Reanimator archetype as it's been played in Tribal Legacy Wars. Again, I think it's an archetype that has probably been played a little less than you would expect, and I wonder if card availability is part of that. Anyways, that's all for this week, and join me next week when you take a look at another Tribal Apocalypse archetype. Thank you.